From Canada, Citizens Forum, where we look at the important issues of the day through a lens of democracy and media and try to figure out, how do we build a better country for ourselves? Hello, welcome to Citizens Forum, coming to you from Victoria, British Columbia. It is Saturday, January the 4th, 2025. This is our second show. Citizens Forum is going to cover, from a Canadian perspective, news and current affairs. But we'd like to do it from an underlying perspective, at least I'd like to do it from an underlying perspective of the underlying problem, which is that we've basically lost our democracy here in Canada. And the Canadian people have become increasingly irrelevant in how decisions are made in our country. And similarly, we've also lost the free press that a democracy requires if it wants to function, because people have to have access to full and honest information if we want to be making intelligent decisions in our own best interests. But when one small group or gang, which is the corporate sector, basically owns and controls all of the big media in the country, which I think one can make an argument that they do, then we have to be suspicious of what we're being told. And what we're being told is very important because it creates a lot of what we think and what we think is going on. So that underlying theme of, are we a democracy? Do our governments work for us? And do we have a free press? Similar to last week, I want to start off talking about the housing issue, because it's such a disaster in Canada. I mean, there have certainly been winners and losers from the housing crisis, but increasingly, I think there are a few very, very big winners. And I'd say they are the banks, the investors, the big landowners, the development companies, the big development companies. They are making speculators, flippers. Some people have made fortunes out of the housing crisis. And I think those people and corporations have created, quite deliberately caused, the housing crisis, because they knew that if they could create a shortage of homes in Canada, a shortage of housing, which is what they've done, then it would push up prices and push up mortgage payments and push up rents. And therefore, some people would be paying huge amounts of money just for a place to live. And the question is, where is that money going? I mean, if so many people are paying so much just for a place to live, then where is their money going? And was this whole mess deliberately caused? And what was the role of the government in helping to create this mess? And what was the role of the media in ignoring it for a very long time and never telling us the truth, perhaps, about what's really going on? Norm.
Yeah, when you're talking about the homeless issue, I was just reading an article this morning about a Ontario member of provincial parliament that I think he was defeated in 2018.
I saw it.
Oh, you saw that? And
Yep.
He's homeless. Now, he'd been in the government for either municipal or the provincial government for 30 years.
Yep.
And what really surprised me in that article, not just that good reminder that you may think you're doing well today, but things can change very fast, I know. But the retired Ontario MPs do not get a pension. Now here we give them, our MLAs, a very lucrative pension after they've been in for a while. That maybe this whole pension idea to government employees or government elected representatives should be thought out. There's quite an imbalance across the country there.
Yeah, I never knew that. And he was a lawyer. He got divorced, which cost him his home. And then he had a stroke or a medical emergency, which made him unable to work for a while. And those few things came together, and suddenly he was homeless and living on the street. I mean, and he mentions in the article that, a lot of people are very close to that same situation. And the homeless crisis is only a part of the housing disaster. I mean, what the people I think what the people who run our country have done is created such a shortage of housing deliberately that for the people at the bottom there is absolutely nowhere to live. I mean, what we should have, I think they say, is 4 to 5 to 6% of housing that's vacant, generally vacant. So there's always openings and there's always places to live. That's the way it used to be. But now there's virtually nothing available. And, not only does it cause a homeless mess, which is, I mean, the homeless are dying and suffering. And the neighborhoods they go into, because they have to have a place to be, those neighborhoods are devastated. And on top of that, people are paying huge rents. Everybody who's renting, not everybody, but lots of people who are renting are paying a lot to rent. And lots of people who have mortgages are paying huge prices on mortgage because the shortage of housing pushed prices up. And I mean, that's the picture. And, how did we get into this mess? And was it deliberately caused? And why is that particular subject? Was it deliberately caused? Because you can make the argument that it was. Why is that never talked about?
Well, I'd certainly like to pick up on there should be, we'll say, 5% vacancy in housing. A friend of mine was a loans officer at a credit union, and she told me that if someone goes for a mortgage and they have a revenue suite, they're only allowed to include 10 months worth of rent into their mortgage application, which is about right. But now you've got people lined up to rent the suites because there's just aren't enough available. There's been a whole change in the structure since she was in the business, 20 years ago, I guess. But the other point I wanted to bring up, and sort of ties in on, I think there is enough money going into housing. It's just where it's being directed. And one place where it's being directed is to the CEOs, et cetera, of the large corporations, which are profiting by it. But we've got to feel sorry for those CEOs. Maybe we should do a garage sale for them. I think it was in 2022, figures I saw, they were getting in the order of 240 times the wage that the average working Canadian. But they've fallen in hard times now, Jack. They're down to only 210 times the amount an average Canadian makes. So there's lots of money in the system somewhere.
Yeah, so I think that story is that as of January the 1st, the first day of work, whatever that is, the top CEOs have made on that first day of work as much as the average Canadian is going to make in the whole year. And it's true. There's been over the past, I would say, 50 years, a slow and then rapidly increasing transfer of income and wealth to the people at the top. Canada used to be a middle-class country, and we had a good social safety net so that the people at the bottom were also taken care of. But now what's happened is that has largely disappeared, and those at the top are simply taking everybody else's money and wealth and enriching themselves. And that's what Canada's become.
There's another group that I really bother me. They don't make as much, but they're still well up there, and that is the senior bureaucrats working for government. We keep getting this, we have to pay them the highest salaries so we can get the best. And I get this from the local municipality, the chief administrative officer. We've got to pay them big dollars to get the best. Well, there's something like 120 municipalities in BC, and I can assure you, not all of them have the best. Yet they all seem to be competing to see who can pay them the most. And there has to be a little more understanding that you can't keep taking money from the people, whether it's in housing, whether it's in taxes, who cares where, and giving it to the small select group at the top. And that's actually created, I guess you could say, almost a new aristocracy.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, we can also mention that the big banks last year made, I think, over $60 billion in profit just for the big banks. And plus, they can hide money in many, many different ways. So when they admit to making 60 billion in profit, we have no idea really of how much they are making. And if Canada chose to take 10 billion of that in taxes on the banks, and they went to only 50 billion in profit for the year, and we invested that in housing and taking care of people at the bottom, I think we'd be a better country. And yet there's no discussion of that. We can't have that discussion because, you know, the banks and the corporations basically run the governments and control the media. So the kind of issue of should we tax the banks more just never gets
Well, you know,
mentioned.
the whole profits at the banks sort of confuse me. That I can understand, shall we say, bank services for charged to administer your account, etc. But most of the bank's profits come from the money they make on lending you the money. But the thing is, that money, before you walk in the bank to borrow the money, didn't exist. They create almost all of that money out of thin air and then charge you for the privilege of them creating the money out of thin air. There's,
Yes.
I mean, it's bigger than the whole fiat money situation. We need a new monetary system. I guess you could say globally, certainly in Canada, that there's just no reality to our money. And
I got something from the Council of Canadians via email sometime in the very recent past, and they were suggesting some things that the federal government could do to increase equality, income equality, and wealth equality in the country. And believe me, income equality and wealth equality are very important in terms of how a society is functioning and how healthy a society is. And what the Council of Canadians suggested was introduce a wealth tax. And they say a wealth tax on net wealth of over $10 million could raise about $30 billion a year. Now, is that a good idea? Are those correct figures? Is that what we want to do? I don't know. But at least something like a wealth tax is something we should be discussing because it's not a bad idea.
yeah, well,
They also suggest a windfall profits tax on corporations that are, start making fortunes, for example, in the oil and gas industry, where we get very little in royalties from the oil and gas that we as Canadians own. And they also say raise the corporate income tax, which has been significantly slashed over the past 20 years, and shut down the loopholes that allow the wealthy to avoid taxes. I mean, those are good ideas, I think, but they don't happen because whether we Canadians may want them or not, it ain't going to happen because we don't matter.
We've got to look at the whole income distribution, asset equality discussion because it's getting more and more out of hand. And I think there was a time that the corporations were somewhat balanced with the people, but I get the feeling now we're going back to, shall we say, the late 1800s with at that time, mostly railroad tycoons and referred to as robber barons. And that's exactly what many corporations seem to feel. They're back in that position that they can take all the wealth and all the resources, and everyone else, I was going to say people on the street, and that's probably where a lot of us will end up, is we're scrambling for the scraps that we can find on the street.
Yeah, it's true of a lot of people, yeah. We're going to move on to some polling numbers, and this is a poll, and I think most people know this. The top it's the top 5 current issues that are important to Canadians, top issues facing Canada. And the first one in this graph anyways, and I think no matter who does the poll, it's going to be fairly similar. The first one is the cost of living. That's what Canadians right now think is the most important issue, and it's true. The cost of living for a lot of people is a disaster. Second one is healthcare. And, our healthcare system also is filled with problems. Although people do their best, the workers do their best who are in the healthcare system. But those at the top, we have to really wonder what they're up to. The third one is housing affordability, which ties right into the first one, which is cost of living. The fourth one is the environment and climate change. And the fifth one shown in this list is immigration. And I think the concern about immigration is really tied into the concern about housing and the cost of living, healthcare, right? Because we already don't have enough homes for the people who live here, and nor do we have, it seems, a healthcare system that can handle the people who live here. So bringing in more people, of course, causes additional stress on those systems, which could be working much better. And the point I want to make is that I really think that if Canada were a more democratic country, and if we also had an honest and independent media, then these situations would be, for most of us, a lot better. I think the cost of living can be brought down in major ways if we Canadians had a voice in our own governance, because we don't necessarily want these things, but they happen. And the same with healthcare. I think the healthcare system could work much, much better if we Canadians were running it in our own interest, but we don't. It's run by basically the pharmaceutical industry and the politicians who I think you can make the argument that they control. And then housing affordability is the same, and on and on. So I think if we were a more democratic country, we would see big improvements in these issues that we think and know are very important to us. So the issue of democracy and a free press are not just things that are irrelevant and nice to talk about but don't have impacts. I think they have major impacts on us, and we should be talking about how can we build the better democracy that maybe we need.
Well, I almost see all 5 of those issues as one issue, and that is the distribution of wealth and the inequality. That split is getting bigger and bigger literally every day, I think. And a lot of that does go back to the media, the mainstream media, which is controlled so much by the ones that are more equal at the top of the food chain. And that's got to change.
I agree. It's got to change, and we've got to really focus on that. But of course, those who do run things have us focused on everything else instead of these very important issues that we've got to deal with. I just want to mention something about the environment, which was number 4 issue on that list of. And to me, the environment is very, very important. I really think that it's, if we destroy the planet, which we seem to be on the road to doing, nothing else really matters. So,
well, I was going to just add to that which is more important, the economy or the environment? And the way I see it, if we have no environment, the economy doesn't matter very much at all.
Yeah. And there are some small things we can do that are fairly easy just to help things into the right direction. One thing is all the food courts at our malls that use throwaway everything. I mean, there's no need for that. It is a massive waste. It's like kicking dirt in Mother Nature's face. I mean, we just don't care, you know. We go to these food courts. Why not put pressure on them to start at least using knives and forks that are made of metal and are reusable 1,000 or 10,000 times, and plates and cups? I walked past a Starbucks a few days ago. Not only was there a long lineup, it was of cars in their drive-through lane, which is crazy in itself. But I didn't see one person in the Starbucks, and it was packed, using a real cup. I don't even know if the Starbucks has real cups anymore. It's just all throwaway. And why? And the same in our food stores. And so everything is overpackaged to the extreme.
Well, I'm not sure about the Starbucks cups. They may be a form of plastic, but a lot of the cups are paper. Now think about this. Can you put water into a paper cup? What does it take to make it hold the chemicals that are impregnated that people... I quite often take my own coffee cup to a coffee shop just so I don't get the paper cup. Besides, I don't like the taste of the chemicals in paper in my coffee.
Yeah, all of that is very, very true. I think we've got to be willing to reduce our consumption, and we've just got to face that fact that we've got to reduce our consumption. I mean, one thing we could do, another thing we could do, is more trains in Canada. In our cities, light rail transit or trams, which are just like electric buses on rail. It would make such a positive difference in so many ways to the amount of waste we create, because cars are a huge creator of pollution and destroying the planet. I don't know why over the last 40 or 50 years, well, over the last century, we got rid of the trams and trains that we used to have, moved to cars, and now we can't go back, although in many places, Europe, South America, Asia, trains and trams are everywhere, and they just let us we can use less and still get around.
Well, in Victoria, I can't remember seeing trams or trolley cars, but I can remember there were still some of the rails in the streets in Victoria when I was a very young child. It's one of those fuzzy memories, but I do remember it. We did have it here in Victoria and most other cities. We had it. And this whole love affair with a car and making everything better for a car, that the BC Motor Vehicle Act has some good words, but the way the police enforce the Motor Vehicle Act, the car is the most important creature on the road. Pedestrians and cyclists, or as they call vulnerable road users, they have to take a second step back for cars. I've even had the police tell me that he was not going to tell people what side of the road to walk on in a rural area. The Motor Vehicle Act is quite clear that we've just gone so much into the car is absolutely at the top of the whole scheme of things, and everything has to be easier for the car.
And there's an interesting story which I found out about maybe 30 years ago from a friend. I'd never heard it before that, about how in the United States and then later in Canada, three or four huge companies back in the 1930s and 40s created a new company. It was Exxon was one, Standard Oil it was called at the time, General Motors was one, Firestone Tires. So those three companies created another corporation whose name I can't remember. And what they did was they went around the United States buying up the train and tram systems that existed in every large town and city in the United States. They bought them up and they shut them down. So they forced people into the car because they closed down what were very good public transit systems at the time. And I'd never heard that before. They were actually taken to court and found guilty by a jury of conspiracy to do something. I don't remember what it was. And then the judge, who no doubt was on the payroll, fined them $1, and that was that. But they did do it. And why aren't we ever told about this? Because it's a very, very interesting story about how the corporate sector made a plan. They wanted to push us into cars, so they simply purchased and destroyed the public transit systems of the day.
I hadn't heard that story, but going back a step further, the automobile industry was very big on taking the pedestrians' rights away from using the street. That I guess it was the American Automobile Club, it was done under their auspices, were quite aggressive in the 1910s, 1920s, removing people's right to use the street and making it just for the use of cars.
Norm, you had a topic from a magazine called Druthers that you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I'll just bring that up on a share here. I guess I should do a little bit of a promo for Druthers. They're in my opinion, one of the true alternate media. They're not controlled or run by anyone other than the faces behind it, and we're printing the news that the public doesn't get to see from the mainstream media. You can find it online at this druthers.ca. And it's a 12-page newspaper. It comes out every month. And many interesting articles. This particular one, Democracy, A Farce Called Freedom, I think ties in a lot with what we were talking about earlier today. That this article, I think, sort of makes the point that we really don't live in a democracy. It's this representative democracy where we elect people to go to, in our case, to Ottawa to do things as they want. But it also does point out that a real democracy, as in what we think of the Greek city-states of having a democracy, that also runs into problems with the mob rule. And I'll just scroll down to a point in the article here that we're all quite familiar with, the stories about Socrates having to drink a cup of hemlock. Well, that was because the mob, it was democratically decided, but it was a democratic mob, if you want to call it that, that convicted him of a very heinous crime of corrupting the youth of the day. Well, what he was doing was encouraging the youth to question authority. In my opinion, you can't have a democracy unless you are constantly questioning the authority of the democracy. Are they actually working for the people? And that rolls up to the last part of the article, where they go through and they look at how democracy starts out with their society, I guess you could say, starts out with a good leader, that maybe not that leader, but a few generations later, that king leader starts descending into a tyrannical control. In time, that's taken over by the aristocrats, I guess you could say, of the society, who then get right into this whole, really, I'd call it fascism, where aristocrats historically, but now the large corporations are running the society and running the government, which is the definition of fascism. So when we talk about democracy, we have to really understand just what are we looking at and being on guard to keep the democracy. In this case, the Americans with their, First Amendment of the Constitution, where they had the right to bear arms. Now, I certainly don't recommend that we pick up our local shotgun or whatever and go running to Ottawa and attack it. But in those days, the military and the citizenry had relatively equal power of weapons. And just the fact that the citizens could stand up to the government anytime kept them under control. That more recent times that didn't work when the Branch Davidia in Waco, Texas, tried to take on the government. Of course, the government showed up with all their military forces, and that didn't end well for the Branch Davidia or whatever it was.
Yeah, there is an old saying that the price of democracy is eternal vigilance, and we lost our vigilance quite a while ago, if we ever had it, and we've certainly just about completely lost our democracy. And it is important in our everyday lives, as I said. I think our the everyday life of I think we'd have a better society, we'd have better communities, we'd have better lives in many ways if we had more democracy, and if we, the people, had a voice in our governance. I don't think we'd be going downtown and seeing homeless people all over the streets and in our neighborhood parks. If we had more democracy, I really think we would and could fix those problems up.
Well, I was going to say part of that, it concerns me, this democracy descending into mob rule. And I think the last 4 years with COVID, that article I brought up points out that Trudeau made quite a point of the majority of the public wanted social distancing, wanted the vaccines, etc. Well, I'm not convinced they did, but he was in a position to convince people that that's what the masses wanted, that we were run by the mob rule. The same thing in the States, that using the media, using the government, they created the narrative and convinced a great many people to stampede in the direction they wanted, which really is very much a mob.
Yeah. I just want to very quickly move on to a story from the States. This is being filmed on January 4th, so just 3 days ago, there was that kind of mass murder that took place in New Orleans, where somebody driving a truck just ran over and killed. Right now, it's 14 people dead, and I think about 36 people injured and seriously injured. So, I mean, that incident was a horrible disaster, and it's hard to fathom what makes people get to such a level that they're able to do that kind of thing. But the government and the media are linking that now to a terror attack, because they said there was an ISIS flag found in the driver's vehicle. And I just want to talk about that for a minute, because it, to me, shows how kind of misled we can be if we trust the media. So they say that this guy, had an ISIS flag and was linked to ISIS. But what the media won't say, and what the politicians won't say, is that there is a lot of evidence and a lot of experts with real credentials will argue that ISIS was created by the United States, the CIA, and some of its major allies, in order to destabilize countries that they wanted to destabilize. So when an ISIS flag is found in a drive, in the car of somebody who commits a murder, I mean, what is ISIS really? We have a picture in our mind, but that picture may very, very well not be correct.
Well, I was just going to say,
it's important.
Do you have a picture in your mind, or do you have a picture the media told you to have?
Well, yeah, exactly.
And we're looking at that, there's a couple of things about that whole incident that make me suspect it just may have been a false flag. That apparently the ex-military person that did it was a U.S. citizen, but the rented truck he had, they were able to find that, first, there's two news reports in this, take the one you want. apparently he crossed from Mexico into the States at this, shall we say, main immigration or immigrant portal, or what is it, Eagle Pass. Apparently he crossed 2 days ago and he was driving it. The other media story is, it was a rental vehicle, so anybody could have been driving it a month ago. That's when it crossed. Well, as soon as I start hearing conflicting stories coming out from the media, at that point, I really very much think it was a false flag. That how could they make up these stories unless it was all planned in advance to keep people confused?
Yeah, we do have to look at the whole story and question it, because, the media do lie to us, and so do our governments, and we've got to always keep that in mind, which isn't to say that this story, at least those facts, are not correct, but we've got to question them. I want to read something about ISIS from a website that I follow. I certainly don't agree with this website on everything, but they have experts writing for them. It's called globalresearch.ca. Globalresearch.ca. It's run by, I think, a fellow who was a professor for many years in Canada, Michel Chossudovsky. And this is a few of the things he says in an article about ISIS. And these are things that we just are not allowed to hear from the regular media. And from what I've seen in other places, this at least could be true. So what they say is the Islamic State, ISIS, was originally an Al-Qaeda affiliated entity created by U.S. intelligence with the support of Britain's MI6, Israel's Mossad, Pakistan's ISI, and the Saudi Arabian General Intelligence Presidency. So that's what these people are saying, that ISIS was created by Western intelligence agency. It says ISIS brigades were involved in the U.S. NATO insurgency in Syria. He says NATO and the Turkish High Command were responsible for recruiting people into ISIS, paying them, and forming the ISIS army. He says there are Western special forces and Western intelligence operatives within the ranks of ISIS, and British special forces have been involved as well. There was a case in Britain where a man was being charged. This was just several years ago. A man was being tried in Britain for supporting ISIS. He was on trial in a British court, and his lawyers brought forward information that MI6, which is the British intelligence service, was also funding and supporting and training and giving weapons to ISIS. So the case against him collapsed, because how could he be found guilty of supporting ISIS when the British government was doing exactly the same thing? So I'm not saying this is correct, although I think there is a lot of truth in it. But I am saying that we've got to question the stories that we're told.
You do somewhat the same thing I do, that you look at sites that have information that, shall we say, doesn't fit comfortably for you. You don't necessarily agree with it, but it's nice to know what the others are saying so you can make some form of balance in the news. That we're certainly not getting it in the mainstream media anymore, any form of balance. We have to create our own balance.
Yes. And there was a similar case in Canada where we were kind of lied to. And this is the case, the only case that I could follow from beginning to end, because it actually happened here in Victoria, British Columbia. And it was the 2013, I would call it, RCMP bombing of the BC legislative buildings. The bomb was planted, but never set off. And it was a huge story in 2013, because here was a young couple that had become Muslims. They were Christians, but became Muslims because they thought it was a good religion. And it was found that they were arrested planting a bomb on the grounds of the legislative buildings set to go off on Canada Day, when the place was filled with families and children, right? So a horrible story. But it was later found, and the media pushed this story for 3 years. I mean, this story was told over and over and over and over again, and our governments too. But the judge freed them. The bombing, fake bombing happened in 2013. The judge freed them in 2016, saying that the police had entrapped them. And it was an amazing story of what the RCMP did to get these people to plant the bomb. They befriended them. They gave them money. These were very, a couple that was just close to being on the streets. They threatened them. My understanding is they even threatened their families if the couple did not plant the bombs. Over 200 RCMP agents were involved. Some of them hired their own lawyers because they felt that what they were doing was illegal. And they felt that in the end, the RCMP brass was going to throw them under the bus. So these RCMP officers hired their own lawyers. And in the end, the case was thrown out. The couple is now suing the Canadian government in a case that doesn't really get any media coverage. But that's what I mean. The media knew this. The federal government knew it from the beginning because the RCMP was acting under the orders of course, of the Harper government. And yet the story was told us over and over again that young couple, Muslim, bombing, terror, and it was all a police story. And we've just got to keep these things in mind because that's the way the people who run things operate. And for us to just trust them when they tell us something is very dangerous for us in many, many ways.
Well, Jack, that was one incident that definitely got the public's attention for whatever reason. But how many other ones are the police doing it now, trying to manipulate? I won't go into the details. I think I know of one going on right now, very small scale, but the police trying to manipulate everything so the person can be found to be wrong. And fortunately, in this case, it won't go public, I don't think, in the big scheme of things like the one you're talking about. But so much of what's going on now seems to be manipulated for other purposes against the people.
Yeah, we've got to be careful. We've got to be careful because our futures are at stake because we're seeing greater and greater wealth inequality in Canada. And instead of dealing with that issue and everything that surrounds it, as well as the destruction of our environment and the poisoning of us all by GMO foods and all the chemicals they put in our foods, they keep creating other stories to focus our attention on, the foreign enemies. Well, maybe we have foreign enemies, but I think our own Canadian enemies, the corporations, and these are worldwide corporations that run, I think, you can make the argument they run Canada. That, to me, is an issue we should be looking at much more closely. We've got to rebuild our democracy. We've got to make our governments be working for us. And we certainly need the free press that a democracy requires if we want to move ahead. And, it's our health, the futures of our families and all the children of today. That's what's at stake. And, we've got to deal with that.
Well, I was going to say that I really feel this goes from personal experience from the 1970s, the height of the environmental movement, if you want. The government, and by that you can extend it to the corporations, are more afraid of the people than they are of their local people than they are of any foreign actors. Their people have to be controlled, which brings in a whole, I guess you could say, almost take it into a spiritual realm. Why do these people have to control us? What benefit? Yeah. They don't really even need or want the money other than it gives them the ability to control. And that's really at the top of the pyramid is we have to control people.
We're going to move on to a couple of, news stories of the day. I thought I had two, but we already talked about one. So I've got one, which is about Mr. Trudeau proroguing Parliament. And I just came across a story from Britain, if I can find it. Yeah. The question is, does the Prime Minister have the power to prorogue Parliament? Canada is supposed to be a parliamentary democracy where Parliament has power. Clearly, a lot of people in Parliament want to get rid of Justin Trudeau. But what we're being told is Mr. Trudeau is going to prorogue Parliament and, for a couple of months and blah, blah, blah. And I don't know why we're accepting that as a legal thing for him to do. And I just came across a story in Wikipedia. So basically the story is that on 28th of August, 2019, the Parliament of the United Kingdom was prorogued by Boris Johnson. So August 28th, 2019, Parliament was prorogued by Boris Johnson. The Parliament itself was furious, and members of Parliament went to court. Just a couple of weeks later, on October the 14th, in early September, the Supreme Court of Britain found that Boris Johnson's proroguing of Parliament was illegal. And the very next day, Parliament began to sit again. So again, the story was that Boris Johnson in 2019 prorogued Parliament, and very quickly the British Supreme Court ruled that that was illegal, and Parliament began to sit again. Now,
well, Jack, I was going to say that we are looking more towards the American system of government, but our system of government is the Westminster system of government. In other words, it is definitely a reference case what the Supreme Court did in Great Britain when they ruled that he could have prorogued Parliament. And I totally agree with that position. Mind you, I'm going to say from the other angle, I'd like to see Trudeau prorogue Parliament. And the reason why I'd like to see him prorogue it there is when he does that, all the legislation that has not been passed goes out the window. They've got to start it over again. And there's all sorts of legislation associated with free speech, with healthcare products and everything else that they're rushing to get through before the, election in October of this year, sometime around then, that I'd like to see Parliament stopped. All those, they're going to start them all over again. And when they start them over, that means in the Senate as well as in the House of Commons. So maybe rather than worrying about him proroguing Parliament, we should be encouraging him to do it.
Yeah, well, people may say that, but the fact is that
there's a whole
Prime
legal issue, I
Minister
agree.
already has far too much power, and and our Parliament is pathetic. Our Parliament is pathetic.
Yeah.
But still, allowing the Prime Minister to shut down Parliament is, in my way of thinking, the next step in the disaster that's happening.
I agree totally with you on it's wrong, but I'm just sort of thinking,
Yeah.
boy, there'd be a real advantage if he does, and it would actually be the will of the people.
Yeah. It's, and I'll repeat again, our Parliament, because the Prime Minister has all the power, and provincially the Premier has all the power. The people we elect, our parliamentarians, are powerless. They can't represent us even if they want to. And that is the basis of our democracy, and it's gone. They simply, the party leadership has all the power, and the people we elect are as irrelevant as we are, which is not what you want a country to be.
I'll shift your word power to control. That's what it.
Yeah.
It's more that's the whole focus is the control.
Yeah. So that was my news story of the day. Do you have one?
Well, you got me in that one. I was going to have a news story today about proroguing Parliament and the whole issue there.
Okay.
But we may be getting an answer on what's going on by, Wednesday the 8th, when the Liberal caucus is having a meeting specifically to discuss Trudeau's leadership. Now, what's coming out of it, and it's, well, frankly, a mystery to me why Trudeau hasn't stepped down. That, personal politics aside, if you were disliked as much as Trudeau is by the people, by your own party, would you be staying in that seat, or would you decide it's time to retire? Why is he still there? Who's telling him to stay in that seat? What's the end goal of keeping him there? It's got me baffled.
Yeah. And I guess all we can do is stay tuned because, we'll see. We'll see where it looks like a conservative government with Pierre Poilievre as our next prime minister. That seems to be where we're going.
Do you think that'll be a better government?
I think for the rich, it will be a better government.
Yeah.
Mr. Poilievre is not a friend of working people or the poor in economic issues, on tax issues, on housing issues. He'll get rid of the dental program that was brought in recently, I think, and
Well, I keep having a big question with Poilievre. His parents, I believe they're all still alive, were not wealthy people. They're school teachers, etc. They, I assume, did quite well in the middle class. But he's never, apart from having a paper route, worked outside of in the political system for political parties. How come his estimated value, net asset value, is $25 million? Where did he get that money? To me, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Trudeau, I think, is worth around $100 million, but we have an idea where at least some of his money came from. But Poilievre, I'm sorry, I just don't see how he earned $25 million.
And that's a good point. A lot of politicians become very wealthy because they can legally take money from the corporate sector and from the rich. My understanding is that when Trudeau became leader of the Liberal Party 10 years ago or whenever it was, he went on a speaking tour where he was paid, many thousands of dollars a night to speak to various business groups. And that's perfectly legal and doesn't even have to be reported except when you fill out your income tax, because it wasn't campaign contributions. It was just, they hire him to speak to them, and that's okay. And, that's one of the ways the corporations and the rich control our politicians. They just feed them money.
But you'd have to do a lot of talking to get $25 million in a few years.
The big politicians, they get $20,000-$30,000 for a 1 hour talk at a show. So it adds up. But you're right. It takes a lot of time to make millions. So Norm, I think that's it for Citizens Forum for today, unless you have any last words.
No, I think we're not getting paid the big bucks, so I'm going to keep my words to myself.
Okay. And I'll just finish off by saying, this is our view of some of the news and current affairs of the day, but seen from an underlying perspective of our loss of democracy, our loss of a free press here in Canada, and the desperate need to get them back. And they can be gotten back. But step one is we've got to realize that we've lost them, that we've lost our democracy, and that democracy is important. If you feel it is, I don't know if we're showing an email on this show yet, but please feel free to get in touch with us and join in this struggle to rebuild democracy in Canada. Thank you, Norm.
Well, I'll just say what our email address is that they can get in touch with us now is news@independenttv.ca. So there's two T's in there, the last of independent and TV.
News@independenttv.ca. Thank you very much, Norm, and thank you, Ryan, who's filming this show for us. And thanks to all of you for watching this second show of Citizens Forum.